She arrived at Pembroke Estate in the middle of a January rainstorm with one traveling bag and her father's accounting ledgers, because the ledgers were the only things left that were worth carrying. Daphne Drayton had buried her father in November, her reputation in December, and her last real option somewhere in between. She was 27 years old. She had no money, no prospects, and a last name that had been dragged through every courthouse in Caldwell County after her father's death left behind questions. No one seemed interested in answering honestly. What she had was a mind that could read a column of numbers the way other women read scripture. Instinctively, completely, with full understanding of what they were actually saying beneath the surface. If a woman with nothing left but her father's ledgers and her own clear eyes already has you leaning forward, stay with this story. It goes further than you think. Leander Pembroke was not a man who sent letters. He was a man who appeared in doorways. He came to her boarding house on a Thursday morning, the same week the last of her father's furniture had been sold off to settle debts, and he stood in the narrow front room, with his hat in both hands, and the particular expression of a man who has prepared something to say, and is not entirely certain it will hold together once spoken. She had known who he was before he introduced himself. Simon had written about him in every letter from the front. Pembroke is the most infuriating officer I've ever served under, and I would follow him into any engagement without thinking twice. That was as close to a declaration of loyalty as her brother ever came. Miss Drayton, Leander said. His voice was even controlled, the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. Mr. Pembroke, she said. She did not invite him in. She did not offer him a seat. She simply waited, because she had learned very young that the person who spoke first in a silence like this one gave up more than they intended. He glanced at the bare room, the stacked ledgers on the table, the complete absence of anything that looked like comfort, and then he said, Simon asked me to look after you. Before the battle at Guilford Creek, he made me promise. The words landed the way blunt things always did, not sharp enough to cut cleanly, just enough weight to bruise. You mean before he was killed, she said. Something crossed his face, not quite guilt, but something in the same neighborhood. Something that had been living in him long enough to put down roots. Before he went missing, he said, and that word, missing, landed differently than she had expected. No one uses that word anymore, she said carefully. The army declared him dead 6 months ago. I know what the army declared. His jaw tightened. I also know what I saw and what I didn't see, and I have spent 6 months with those two things in uncomfortable conflict. He met her eyes directly. I am not certain Simon Drayton is dead. I want you to know that before I say anything else. She stood very still. She pressed her hands flat against her apron and breathed through the sudden tightness in her chest, and she said, Tell me what you came to say. He told her. He had an estate in Burke County, 400 acres of bottomland and timber, a working household, and a manager he could no longer trust. He had been home from the war for 8 months and had spent those months doing what broken men always did. Maintaining the exterior shape of a life while everything inside it quietly collapsed. He had not been watching the accounts. He was watching them now. What he saw concerned him. I need someone honest, he said. Someone who understands numbers and cannot be bought. He held her gaze. Simon said you kept your father's books from the time you were 15. He said you could find a discrepancy in an account the way a hunting dog finds a scent, without effort, just by being near it. My father was a careful man, she said. Then, someone destroyed him with lies and I was not fast enough to stop it. She held Leander's gaze steadily. I intend to be faster now. He studied her. Then he said what he had come to say. I am offering a practical arrangement. Marriage. Your debts are settled. The Drayton name attaches to mine, which means it survives. You have a home and legal standing. In return, you help me find what's wrong with my estate accounts, before whatever is wrong destroys everything I came home to protect. She looked at him for a long moment. That is not a proposal, she said. That is a ledger. Yes, he said. He didn't soften it. I won't dress it up in language it doesn't deserve. She absorbed that. There was something almost respectful in the refusal to perform warmth he didn't feel. He was offering her a transaction and calling it exactly what it was. 2 conditions, she said. He waited. First, I work, not at embroidery and social calls. I work on whatever is broken until it is fixed. She held his gaze. Second, you tell me about Simon. Everything you know and everything you don't, every doubt, every detail. I will not agree to anything without the truth about my own brother. Pembroke was quiet for 3 full seconds, then, agreed, he said. Both conditions. She put out her hand. He took it. His grip was dry and brief and entirely without performance. They married the following Friday in the county judge's office, with 2 witnesses borrowed from the hallway. Daphne wore her best dress, gray wool that had been her mother's, altered when she was 19, and carried no flowers because it was January, and she had more important things to think about. Judge Trent read the ceremony in 12 minutes. When it was finished, she felt not joy, not love, but the particular steadiness of a woman who has made a hard decision and intends to see it through. Pembroke Estate was not what she had imagined. She had expected a wealthy man's house to feel settled, sure of itself. What she found instead was a house maintained out of habit rather than care. Clean rooms arranged by someone who no longer thought about how they felt to live in. A kitchen where Mrs. Fay, the housekeeper, presided with iron competence and a quiet sadness she had clearly been carrying for some time. Her room was at the opposite end of the hall from his. This had been understood without discussion, the way things are understood between 2 people who have agreed on a transaction and are careful not to complicate it. She unpacked in 20 minutes, set her father's ledgers on the desk, and went to find the estate accounts. Mrs. Fay discovered her there an hour later, standing over an open ledger, with the particular focused stillness of a woman who has found something that does not add up. Mrs. Pembroke, Mrs. Fay began, in the tone of a woman with strong opinions about where new brides ought to spend their first evening. Mrs. Fay, Daphne said pleasantly, without looking up, how long has Mr. Colton managed the accounts? The housekeeper's voice shifted in a way that told Daphne nearly everything she needed to know before the answer came. 7 years, ma'am. And does Mr. Pembroke review the ledgers himself, or does he take Mr. Colton's summary? A long pause. Mr. Colton is thorough, Mrs. Fay said, which was not an answer. Daphne made a note in the margin and went back to reading. Pembroke appeared in the doorway at 10 o'clock that evening. I meant for you to rest, he said. It was your wedding day. Then tell me, she said, turning a page, why your timber revenue from last season shows here as 400 board feet per acre. But your labor records 2 pages earlier suggest you employed half the workforce needed to produce that number. Her finger found the line. Either you have undocumented men working your timber, or those figures are wrong. He crossed the room and looked at the ledger over her shoulder. The silence that followed had a particular quality. The silence of a man encountering something he had been avoiding and could no longer pretend not to see. Show me, he said. She showed him. They sat at that desk for 2 hours as the January dark pressed cold against the windows, working through every inconsistency she'd found, and there were 7, in a single ledger, in a single night. He asked sharp questions, she answered sharper ones. The strange performance of the day stripped away entirely, replaced by something cleaner. 2 minds working on a real problem, without pretense, without unnecessary language. At midnight Pembroke sat back. I've been letting this go since August, he said flatly. I know, she said without cruelty. He looked at her. You're not going to tell me it wasn't my fault. Would that help? A long silence. No, he said. Then I won't say it. She picked up her pen. What will help is doing what needs doing. Are you ready? He was quiet then. Yes. He stood. I'll speak with Colton tomorrow. Ask him to present the original receipts from the past 3 years. Don't tell him why yet, she said. If Colton is honest, he'll welcome the question. If he isn't, she paused. You'll want to know that before he has time to prepare. Something shifted in his expression. Something very close to relief, though she doubted he would have named it that. Daphne, he said. It was the first time he'd used her name. She waited. I'm glad you're here, he said. Don't be glad yet, she said. We haven't found everything that's wrong. She looked back at the ledger. But we will. She left him there, and for the first time in 8 months, Leander Pembroke did not go to bed thinking about the battle at Guilford Creek. He went to bed thinking about the woman at the end of the hall, who had arrived in a rainstorm carrying her father's books and dismantled 6 months of his negligence in a single evening. He thought Simon knew exactly what he was doing. The trouble with Colton arrived on a Tuesday. He came to the weekly accounts meeting with the easy confidence of a man who had never been seriously questioned, and found Daphne already seated in the corner of the study, with a piece of correspondence she appeared to be composing, because she had not been invited, and did not require an invitation. Colton's practiced smile missed his eyes entirely. She said nothing and listened. She tracked every number he spoke against the numbers she'd already found, and in 40 minutes she counted 11 adjustments, small, smooth, each one individually defensible, each one moving in the same direction. When he finished, Pembroke said, I've requested an independent audit of the past 3 years' receipts. Standard procedure. I should have done it long before now. Something happened behind Colton's eyes, brief and almost invisible, like a flame responding to a draft that had no business being there. Of course, he said. I'll have everything prepared. He left, the door closed. Daphne set down her pen. He shifted his explanation for the timber contracts 3 times in 4 minutes, she said. The second version contradicted the first and the third contradicted both. She looked at Pembroke, and when you mentioned the audit, he blinked for nearly 5 seconds without stopping. Confident men don't do that. How much? Pembroke asked. She considered. Somewhere between 15 and 20% of net annual revenue. Over 3 years. The auditor will know better than I do. Pembroke walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the January fields. I should have seen this sooner. Yes, she said simply. He turned to look at her. You're not going to tell me it wasn't my fault. Would that help? A silence. No, he said. Then I won't say it. What will help is moving quickly. He looked out the window, and she watched the precise moment he made his decision. The shift in his shoulders, the slow release of a breath. Yes, he said. I'm ready. She nodded and went back to work. The county's opinion arrived like weather, sideways and relentless, giving no advance warning. It came first from Mrs. Ashbrook, a thin-voiced woman from a neighboring property who arrived, bearing a basket of preserves no one had asked for, and opinions about things she had no business discussing. People are worried about Leander, Mrs. Ashbrook said, with the sweetness of someone who had learned that cruelty was acceptable in concerns clothing. A man grieving a friend, managing alone. He's vulnerable to outside influence. Daphne set the preserves aside without opening them. How thoughtful of you to visit. I only mean, Mrs. Ashbrook continued, that asking questions about a man's accounts so soon after a marriage, it makes people wonder. Wonder what exactly? Daphne asked. Whether the trouble started with the books. Mrs. Ashbrook tilted her head, or whether it started at the altar. Daphne looked at her for a long, calm moment. The audit was my husband's decision, she said. The discrepancies were in the ledger before I arrived. The man who put them there has been collecting a salary from this estate for 7 years. She placed the basket gently back into Mrs. Ashbrook's hands. Thank you for the visit. That evening, Pembroke came home already knowing. He walked in and looked at her across the kitchen with the quiet, contained expression of a man holding something carefully. It's fine, Daphne said. She said what she said. I showed her out. It is not fine. His voice was low, and what lived under it was not low at all. She had no right to come here and suggest. Leander, she said his name deliberately. I grew up in this county. I have been looked past in every room I've ever occupied. Mrs. Ashbrook is not a new experience. She held his gaze. What I need from you is to not go and say something to her husband that turns a rude woman's social call into an actual conflict. The audit will be the response worth giving, not a confrontation. He was quiet for a moment. You are remarkably difficult to argue with. My father argued county tax records with commissioners at midnight, she said. I had good training. She pointed at the door with the spoon. Go wash up. He went. She let out a breath and turned back to the pot and stirred it, and after a while the quiet almost did what she needed it to do. It was in the 3rd week that she found Simon's letter. It was tucked inside the back cover of the oldest estate ledger. Folded tight, the paper worn soft with handling, as though it had been opened and refolded many times. She might have missed it entirely if the edge hadn't caught the lamplight at exactly the right angle. She opened it slowly. It was dated 4 months before the battle at Guilford Creek. It was addressed to Leander. If you're reading this, one of 2 things happened. Either I didn't make it, or I chose not to come back. I want to be honest with you about the fact that I don't yet know which it will be. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know there was a decision involved, not just a battle. If I'm gone, look after Daphne. Not because she needs saving, she doesn't. But because the world is unkind to women alone and I won't be there to remind it to be decent. She's the most capable person I know and the most stubborn, which means you'll have to not give her the option of refusing. You know how. You've been doing it to me for 3 years. If I chose not to come back, trust me, there are reasons I may not be able to explain yet. I'm sorry for what I can't say. I love you both, Simon. She sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. The January night settled around the house. Somewhere down the hall, she heard Pembroke's steady footsteps. She thought about putting it back where she'd found it. She thought about it for longer than anything should require. Then she folded it, tucked it in her pocket, and went to find him. He was in the front room with a property map spread across the table. He looked up when she came in, read her face the way he'd apparently been doing for weeks. Rapidly, precisely, and straightened without being asked. She placed the letter on the table between them. He looked at Simon's handwriting. Something moved through his expression that he did not control in time to hide. He picked it up and read it. She watched him reach the lines she had been carrying since she found them. His hand went flat on the table. He read it again. He set it down, a long silence. I gave the order that day, he said. The position we were holding, I assessed the situation and told the men to hold the line. Simon was in the forward position. If I had ordered the pullback 20 minutes earlier, he would have been clear. He met her eyes. I have calculated it. More times than I can say. 20 minutes. That is the margin I have been living in for 8 months. She held his gaze. You were an officer in an active engagement. You made a decision under conditions that gave you incomplete information and demanded an immediate answer. I know what the consequences were. I'm not finished. She waited until he was fully listening. Your decision was imperfect, and Simon may still be alive. Both of those things can be true at the same time without either one canceling the other. She set her hands flat on the table. What you cannot do, what I will not allow you to do, is carry 20 minutes of guilt for a man who wrote in his own hand that a decision may have been his. Pembroke stared at her. She could see the long habit of self-prosecution encountering an argument it hadn't met in this precise form, turning it over, testing it, unable to dismiss it. He didn't go as your soldier waiting to be sacrificed, she said quietly. He went as a man who chose his purpose. And he may have made another choice at the end. If you take that from him and make it your fault alone, you take away the only thing Simon ever guarded more carefully than anything else. His own decisions. The room was very quiet. Then Pembroke sat down. Not with intention, simply sat. The way a man sits when something he has been holding for 8 months is finally placed on a surface that can take the weight. He used to describe you the same way in every dispatch, Leander said. His voice was rougher now, like something had worn through. He would say, whatever situation I've managed to put myself in, I'm already thinking about how Daphne would have fixed it 20 minutes ago. A sound came out of her that was not quite a laugh. The back of her eyes stung. He exaggerated, she said. He didn't. Leander looked at her directly. You've been here 3 weeks. You found Colton's fraud. You handled Mrs. Ashbrook. You reorganized records no one has touched in 15 years. He shook his head slowly. He wasn't exaggerating anything. She didn't know what to do with that. So she picked up the practical thread. He loved you, she said. He wrote about you in every letter home. He said you were the most infuriating officer in the Continental Army and that he would follow you into any battle without question. She held his gaze. I knew who you were before you ever came to my door. I just didn't know how to understand you once I was in the same room. He watched her for a moment. Are you still working that out? Yes, she said, though I'm getting closer. Something happened in his face then. Warmer than anything she'd seen in him, brief but real. And it changed the air between them in a way she felt in her chest and was careful not to examine too closely. She picked up the letter from the table. I'm going to write to the Army's records office in the morning, she said. If Simon's body was never recovered, there is documentation that should exist and doesn't. She paused. I want to know which of those two things he meant when he wrote this. Leander looked at the letter, then at her. We'll find out, he said. Not I'll find out. We'll. She went to bed that night, carrying that word the same way she had been carrying everything these past weeks. Carefully, like something that needed room to settle before she could fully understand its shape. The answer came 6 weeks later, not from the Army's records office but from Simon himself. A letter, addressed to Daphne, in his handwriting, postmarked from a town in Kentucky she had never heard of. Daphne, I'm alive. I can't explain everything yet. I'm sorry for the length of the silence. I'm sorry for what you've been carrying alone. I knew Leander would find you. He's the only person I ever trusted to get it right. I'll explain the rest when I can come home, and I'm coming home, I promise. Tell him I said to stop blaming himself. He'll know what I mean, Simon. She read it 3 times at the kitchen table, alone in the gray February morning. Then she sat with it for a long while in the particular complicated fullness of a thing she hadn't let herself hope for until it was already true. She found Pembroke in the barn with Finn, working on the grain inventory, coatless, sleeves rolled, doing the actual physical work the way she had long stopped being surprised by. She waited until Finn moved to the far end of the barn. Then she held out the letter. He read it. She watched him read it. She saw the moment he reached Simon's name, the small, controlled intake of breath, bitten back before it could become anything larger. Then he read it again. "He's alive," Leander said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. "He's alive," she said, "and he says to stop blaming yourself." She held his gaze. "I think you should listen to him." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "He really did plan all of it, didn't he?" "Yes," she said. She felt warmth move through her and let it. That was Simon. He saw the end of a thing from the very beginning, every time. Leander handed the letter back. He looked at her with dark, steady eyes. Eyes she had spent 2 months learning and was still learning. And he said quietly, "I don't want this to be a transaction anymore." She stood very still. "I haven't thought of it as one for some time," he said. "I think of you." He held her gaze, with the particular directness she had come to understand, was simply how he operated when something mattered to drop the careful perimeter he kept around himself. "What you'll say about a problem. Whether your lamp is still on when I come in from the fields. Whether the letter you're writing is something I should know about." A pause. "I notice you the way I haven't noticed anything in a long time." Daphne looked at him in the cold February barn, with the smell of hay and winter air around them, and she thought about everything she had been turning over all these weeks, carrying carefully, refusing to fan into something before she understood its shape. "I notice you too," she said, simply, without elaboration, because it was enough and they both knew it. He reached out and covered her hand with his, not dramatically, not with the performance of a man constructing a feeling, but with the plain, straightforward intention of someone who has made a decision and means it to hold. She turned her hand over and held his. Finn became extraordinarily interested in a barrel at the far wall. Neither of them looked up. 3 years later, when people in Burke County spoke about Pembroke Estate, and they did speak about it, because it had become the kind of story a community returns to when it needs reminding what's possible. They spoke about the accounts set right, and the manager brought to justice, and the bottomland that yielded better than it had in 15 years. They spoke about Leander Pembroke, who had come home from the war hollowed out and found his way back through the particular, uncompromising practicality of a woman who refused to let him stay lost. They spoke about Simon Drayton, who appeared on his sister's doorstep in the spring of 1820, with a complicated story and a sun-worn face, and was received by his brother-in-law with the restrained, exasperated affection of a man who had understood exactly what Simon had done and decided that gratitude was the more honest response than anger. And they spoke, in the way stories survive when they are worth surviving, about the lawyer's daughter, who arrived in a January rainstorm, carrying her father's accounting ledgers and the kind of pride that does not ask permission to exist, who had come with nothing and built something real, not because she had been rescued, but because she had found the one person willing to stand beside her while she worked. Daphne Pembroke never described herself as someone who had been saved. She described herself, when anyone asked, as someone who had arrived at the right place, at the right time, with the right tools, and had done what needed doing. Leander, who was almost always in the same room when she said this, never offered a correction. He simply watched her with those steady dark eyes and said nothing, because there were no words equal to what she was, and he had long since stopped trying to find them. He stayed every day plainly, without ceremony he stayed. That was the whole of it. That was everything.